All right, are we ready to start? See everybody's smiling face. So good to see everybody back together. Good morning. All right, so let's get started. So we need a flag salute, huh? So why don't we stand for the flag salute? And Jesse, can you lead us? Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice. Thank you very much. So welcome everybody and welcome to Board Member Strauss. I don't know if you want to make some opening comments.
Well, first of all, thanks everyone for being here at this really busy time of year. The agenda today is really important. A lot of our practitioners are watching us and hoping that we will really take thoughtfully some of the recommendations that the CDE is bringing to us. So honestly, your thoughts and your input into this process is really, really important. We're bringing these items up at the State Board meeting in July. And so your input and your comments will be really, really important. So just a preview for how we help our field make this whole system work better is really important. Thanks.
Thank you, Board Member Strauss. So just an overview of today's agenda. We are actually going to take the items in order. So we'll begin with item number 1 on local accountability, plan template input in just a minute. But before we do that, I actually want to welcome to the dais with us Stephanie Gregson, who is the new, Deputy Superintendent of the Performance Planning and Technology Branch. So welcome, Stephanie. We're so glad that you are here with us.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here as well.
Don't know if you have any comments or...
Well, let's see. I think this is day 6 on the job. Of this job, yes. As I was formerly the director of the Curriculum Frameworks and Instructional Resources Division here at the department. And so I'm very excited to bridge curriculum and instruction with assessment and accountability and working with the California System of Support as well. So I'm very excited.
Congratulations on the new job, and I think it is a wonderful opportunity to build some coherence between the two divisions. So thank you, and for the wonderful job you did with the most recent framework. So nice to have that done, and good to have you with us. So just a few announcements, a reminder, so everyone has calendars out of our last 2 meetings for this year. Our 3rd quarter meeting is August 22nd. And our 4th quarter meeting is October 24th. Be sure you have those on your calendar. And as usual today, we'll work our way through the agenda. Take a couple of minutes break when people need. So just nod at me or something if we need to take a break in an item for a stretch. And then we'll take about 15 minutes so that you can get food and another stretch, and we'll have a working lunch, and we'll aim to finish hopefully 2 o'clock, maybe 2:30, 3. That'll be our goal. But what's most important is input on these 2 very important issues. So let me talk a little bit about the format for the day on both items. So we'll set them up the same way in that our group will receive input on the 2 items, and we will take time during those input sessions for clarifying questions. because we will then break into small groups. You see the tables in the room. We will break into small groups for input on both of those items. So I'm going to ask that you reserve comments on input for the small group discussion, but not to hesitate to ask any clarifying questions as we go through the presentations. Okay? And particularly the second item, which is a rather long item, we've asked that we break that into parts so that we have an opportunity to really clarify your thinking before we move into input sessions. Are we good? All right, so with that in mind, I'm going to turn the presentation over on the LCAP template revisions. Item 1. I'm sorry. Yes, item 1.
Well, thank you very much, Chairmember Eiskin, members of the Advisory Committee, Board Member Strauss. Thank you for having us here today. My name is Joshua Strong. I'm the administrator in the Local Agency System Support Office here at the department. I'm standing in for our director, Jeff Brashears, who hopefully is enjoying a much cooler day on the coast. My colleagues and I are here to ask for input regarding the LCAP template redesign. And so we have, as has been said, we're going to approach this from a different structure. We really want to provide you with the opportunity to look at the examples and the thoughts that have been put forth on this so far, and to be able to get your hands dirty in the work, as it were. And so we'll be breaking out into groups later on. But as you can see, what we want to do is provide you with some of the background behind the redesign process, give you an overview of what's happened thus far, talk about the purpose of today's sessions and the guidelines, and then briefly go over the topics that we'll look at today. Then we'll actually participate in the activity. We'll have a report out at the end, and then share with you some final thoughts and some next steps. So, as you are all aware at this point in time, the LCFF, the local control funding formula that was put in place in 2013, requires that all school districts, county offices of education, and charter schools prepare a local control and accountability plan which describes how they intend to address, to meet annual goals in order to address all state priorities that are described within the Ed Code sections. The LCAP is also required to be completed in conformance with the state board adopted, the SBE adopted template. So at the end of the last legislative session, as part of Assembly Bill 1840, the education code related to the template, Education Code 52064, amended that education code to require that the State Board of Education adopt a new template on or before January 31st of 2020. And that template would be used and effective for the 2020 through 2023 LCAP cycle. The legislative intent behind these changes was to streamline the content and the format, to make the information within the LCAP more accessible, and to present information on actions and services that contribute towards increasing or improving services for unduplicated students and associated expenditures in a manner that more clearly shows whether these services are being targeted to specific school sites or provided on a district-wide, county-wide, or charter-wide basis. So at this point, we'd like to highlight some of the particular changes that took place within the revision of statute, and we want to do that by issue. The first change that we'd like to highlight is a requirement that the language within the LCAP template itself be more accessible and understandable to parents and other stakeholders, that it not be formed or framed in educationese, as it were, but that it would clearly and simply articulate what it is that this particular prompt or component within the LCAP is intended to do. Statute goes on to clarify that the instructions for completing the LCAP can be more technical in nature and can be addressed to LEAs, to those that are completing the LCAP. And that's where the technical language in the specifications should reside, not within the body of the template itself. Another revision to the statute is to the prioritization of actions and services. So this statute requires that the instructions contain language that clarifies that LEAs should be prioritizing their goals, actions, and services within the LCAP based on an analysis of their dashboard data. That is, looking at the dashboard, identifying the 2 to 3 most pressing concerns or greatest areas of need within that data, and then primarily focusing the LCAP on those particular pieces to address those areas of highest need and to not ignore everything else, but to approach it from a standpoint of what is it that we need to address first and what are the things that can be left on the back burner to simmer, as it were, not to drop, not to decrease, but to maintain across what's currently being achieved and address those areas of greatest need. And so there's that requirement now within the statute related to the instructions for the LCAP. However, there's also the requirement that LEAs continue to track progress for all of the metrics within the specified LCFF priorities. So it's not doing away with any of the metrics. It's not doing away with the focus on metrics or indicators within the LCAP. It's merely asking LEAs to analyze their dashboard data and identify the areas that most need to be addressed for this particular LCAP. One of the other significant changes that's taken place within statute is the requirement for summary tables, specifically 2 summary tables. The first is an expenditure summary table. The statute requires that the LCAP consolidate all of the expenditures for actions and services in in one or more summary tables throughout the LCAP, and that those summary tables break out the funding for each action and service into one of 4 funding sources. That is specifically LCFF funds, other state funds, local funds, and federal funds, as well as a total of all of the funding that's being budgeted for those particular actions and services. As part of that, there's also a requirement that at the end of the summary table that there be that it be broken out how much of the funding that's been budgeted is for personnel expenditures versus non-personnel expenditures. So the personnel and non-personnel are totals that are taken from the budgeted actions and expenditures within the LCAP. The LCFF funds, other state funds, local funds, and federal funds are per action. And then the other summary table or tables are for the increased or improved services summary, what is currently known as the demonstration of increased or improved services for unduplicated pupils section, which I'm really, really going to look forward to getting rid of that name. Within this particular summary table, the requirement is that the actions that are identified within the LCAP as contributing towards meeting the requirement to increase or improve services for unduplicated students be summarized within one or more tables within a particular place in the LCAP, so that a stakeholder, a parent, members of the LEA can specifically look at that portion of the LCAP and identify what actions or services and their corresponding expenditures are being used to meet the requirement, to contribute towards the requirement of increasing or improving services. This also specifies that the particular expenditures notate whether that expenditure is being done on an LEA-wide basis, on a school-wide basis for districts and county offices of education, or on a targeted basis to one or more single particular unduplicated student groups. The real hope here, the thought behind this is that in summarizing, providing this summary of increased or improved services, that it will be much clearer and upfront, more transparent about how those actions or services are meeting that requirement or contributing towards that requirement. So before we go on, are there any clarifying questions that anyone has at this point in time? Yes.
So I was wondering if there was also a, you have increase and improve summary. Is there something that shows if there's been a decrease in a particular item?
You mean in terms of expenditures?
Mm-hmm.
That particular component would be within the realm of the annual update. The LCAP is required to be updated, reviewed and updated on an annual basis. And as part of that annual review, actions and services or goals might then be adjusted based on the outcomes, the feedback, and the analysis of that annual update. One of the, well, I won't get ahead of myself at this point in time. However, we'll get to that point in a moment. Yes.
Was this assembly bill part of budget trailer or?
Yes.
Okay, so it wasn't. I tried to look it up and it looked like it went on and on and on.
No. It's Assembly Bill 1840. It's part of the statutes of 2018.
Okay, and so you talked a little bit about the focus on the performance on the dashboard, and I was trying to find that because when I read through the ed code this morning, it didn't put that same emphasis on mainly write your LCAP about where you need improvement from your dashboard results. So I wanted to make sure that that emphasis is in the ed code, that we're not kind of adding that on top.
No, it's within the ed code. However, it's not specifically within subsection B of 52064. It's within section E, further down. It actually, the way that statute frames it is that the instructions for the template shall specify that an LEA should prioritize its goals, actions, and services based upon an analysis of relevant data, including data within the California School Dashboard.
I think it said should look at it, decide how and whether to prioritize.
Correct.
Okay, well,
Yes.
how and whether means, and this goes back to something that everyone's always talked about is what needs to be in the LCAP, just the supplemental and concentration funds or everything. And so just want to make sure that people are still kind of, it should be the majority of your funds.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just going to be about, because the dashboard doesn't have everything on it that you might be wanting to do with your
Correct.
funds. So,
And that's where that additional education code comes in, the requirement to continue to track and report performance on the applicable metrics for each state priority. So those will be included within there. It's not focusing specifically on the dashboard to the exclusion of all else. It's saying based on your dashboard results and looking at other data, including local data, what are your areas of greatest need in terms of your goals, actions, and services? Any other questions?
The slides that you have don't match what was online, but part of what is online, it talks about the discussion topics that we're going to be looking at today, and it has 3. But the LCAP has other sections. Are all sections being revised, such as, for example, the stakeholder engagement section, the summary plan section?
So the LCAP in its totality is being redesigned. And so everything that is specifically required within statute is on the table in terms of what will be redesigned. Part of our approach today is simply to bring 3 items to the group for discussion. Part of that is based on the time frame. When we did this last Thursday at the Sacramento County Office of Education, we presented a total of 6 topics. It took 3 hours. And given the other item on the agenda today and the detail that goes into that, we didn't want to keep you here, past 5. So at this point, we're bringing these 3 particular things. The reason that we're bringing these 3 particular items to you is because as part of the redesign, we're not framing things in terms of sections. I mean, currently everybody looks at the LCAP, they're used to thinking of the LCAP in terms of specific sections, specific chunks of information. At this point, what we're bringing forth are ideas and concepts that would address statutory requirements, but we're not grouping them together. We're not trying to provide any sort of framework for where those would live within the template in particular. Because at this point, what we want to do is we really want to flesh out what it is that the greatest overall vision of stakeholders, of the board is in terms of redeveloping this particular template. In particular with stakeholder engagement, one of the things that we did was we reached out specifically to some of our stakeholder partners and asked them to provide some concepts or some frameworks related to that particular piece. Then, based on that feedback, we took it to the June 6th meeting that we did last Thursday. We're also taking it down to the meeting that we're doing in Ventura County Office of Education this coming Thursday. And then based on that feedback, we will solidify that particular design. The designs, the thoughts, the options that we're bringing to you today are things that have already gone through that process. So they were brought up and discussed back in April. They're being discussed again at this point in time based on the changes in the feedback that were provided in April. And that's why they're more fully baked, I guess. And so that's why we're bringing them to you today to get your feedback on them. It's our hope that we'll bring the additional sections back to you in August and be able to provide that to you as well, to get your input on that.
My next question.
Can you just tell us what those other, is stakeholder one of the 3 that?
Stakeholder engagement is one of the 3. The plan summary is another one. And the third one is, it is the prioritization of goals.
All right. And so I think it's a June 25th, that's open to other stakeholders as well, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and then we'll also be doing, although I'm still getting ahead of myself at this point in time, we're also going to be doing a statewide webinar at the end of June. So, but I'll mention that later.
So Joshua, I hate to take you off tracks.
Mhm.
Just to clarify, so we can count on seeing those next 3 sections on our August agenda for input? Thanks.
So, in terms of the overview of the redesign process, as I said, back in April, I believe the date was April 24th. No, April 22nd. We brought a number of these concepts from statute that we were trying to create a skeleton for. And we brought them to a group of stakeholders at the Sacramento County Office of Education. They provided input, and some of the major themes that they provided were to reduce the number of prompts within the plan summary of the LCAP, to the greatest extent practicable, to combine the goals, actions, and services section, what exists currently in the template, with the annual update section of what currently exists in the template, so that you're not cutting and pasting goals and actions and services from the prior year and having to go through that duplication of effort. And then to maximize the use of the tables within the LCAP. Based on that feedback, we brought that feedback to an internal planning group. The internal planning group is composed of State Board of Education staff and CDE staff. And then we shared that also with the Redesign Advisory Group. The Redesign Advisory Group is comprised of 4 county offices of education, 2 school districts, one of them small, 1 charter school, the California Teachers Association, and 2 representatives from advocacy groups. And based on that feedback that they provided, we fleshed out the current examples that we're bringing to you today. So today what we want to do is we want to use a World Cafe approach in order to engage you in dialogue regarding the LCAP template design and to receive feedback for redesigning the template based upon your experience and hopefully your desire to improve the functionality of the template. What we'd like to do in order to maximize this opportunity is to create an environment where everybody can participate, where everyone's comments and thoughts are respected and valued. We focus on what matters, that is the task at hand, engage in creative thinking, speaking, and listening, look for patterns, insights, and deeper connections, and identify common themes. In particular, within engaging creative thinking, I'd like to highlight that what we're bringing to you today are some ideas on paper. However, they are not choices. We're not saying choose A or B. What we're saying is here are some ways that people have proposed to address these particular statutory requirements within the LCAP. What are your thoughts? What are your opinions? Is there a better way to do it? And so if you have ideas or thoughts on how to better display or provide the work, then we ask that you suggest those, that you put those forth. We have Post-it notes, we have blank paper, we have chart paper. If you like drawing stuff, you can draw stuff. We also have note takers at each table in order to capture the dialogue that goes on relative to what you provide. And if you want to take one of the packets that will be provided at the tables and scribble notes, thoughts, and ideas all over it and leave it with us, you're more than welcome to do that. Okay, we would appreciate as much feedback as you are willing to provide. One of the other guidelines to keep in mind is that the statute has also instituted a new requirement, that is the State Board of Education is not allowed to add anything to the LCAP that is not expressly stated in statute. So even if it's a great idea, or even if everybody thinks that it should be included, if it's not expressly required within statute, it can't be added. So just keep that under consideration for these examples as you're looking at them. So the three discussion topics that we have for you today are the LCFF priority metrics and outcomes, the expenditure tables, that is the expenditure tables that summarize all of the goals, actions, and services within the LCAP, and then the increased or improved services tables. So we'll go over each of these quickly. The requirement, the specific requirement, is to track and report progress annually on all state priorities, including the applicable metrics specified within each state priority. The state priorities that have applicable metrics are priority 4, student achievement, priority 5, school climate, I think, and priority 6, which is, no, priority 6 is school climate. Priority 5 is what? Right, I know that. I just can't remember the overall term that it's given. Okay, engagement. Thank you. So what we're bringing in the examples today are, for your consideration, are to identify the related metrics and outcomes for each individual goal, similar to what's being done within the template now, or to identify metrics and outcomes for all goals within a single table. So it would just be one single table for the LCAP that would identify metrics and outcomes for the sum of all of the goals. The next is the expenditure tables. The requirement is for one or more summary tables listing and describing the budgeted expenditures for the ensuing fiscal year to implement each specific action. And the ideas that we're bringing are to identify the related expenditures for each individual goal, that is, one summary table per goal, or to identify the related expenditures for all goals in a single table. And then increased or improved services, one or more summary tables listing and describing the specific actions and budgeted expenditures that contribute towards increasing and improving services for unduplicated students. We have multiple approaches, ways to provide an expenditure, one or more expenditure tables for each goal within the LCAP, or to have a single table for the entire LCAP. Now, we have 3 tables, 1, 2, and 3, and each topic will be discussed at a particular table. So what we'll do here in a moment is when we break out into groups, those 3 tables will each have a single topic. That topic will be engaged at that table, and then members will rotate as they go through. And this information will be provided. They'll go over it again. And so if you have any particular questions related to that, then you can ask those at those particular tables, because they'll provide that clarification for what we're looking at there. Yes.
So thank you for this information and for engaging us in such a thoughtful process. In my mind, I'm able to visualize better the impact of this if I can see some examples.
Mm-hmm.
So are we going to be, like, for example, will there be any examples that we can look like as to see what it would, how it would be reflected in the LCAP with choice A or choice B?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
At each table, you will be given a packet that has a bunch of different samples in it. And you'll be given time to look at it. So for example, if we're talking about The expenditure tables, those will be provided in the following manner. And you'll be given time to look at those, digest what it is that they're saying, ask any clarifying questions, and then provide any thoughts, input on that particular piece that you'd like.
Okay, thank you.
This packet actually includes all 6 sections that we presented last Thursday, as well as sections that, as well as what we'll present this coming Thursday. So what stakeholders are currently looking at, you're also going to be able to see in there. If you have thoughts, ideas, considerations for the topics that we are not addressing today, we would welcome that. You can feel free to email that to any of the staff, to lcff@cde.ca.gov, or to our director, Jeff Brashears. So feedback on things that we're not addressing today, you're welcome to provide.
And is there a link anywhere that perhaps I may have missed that we could actually go there with that packet online?
I don't believe so. However, we're happy to provide digital copies. It's actually 12 different files.
Okay, thank
So
you.
if you want to see them, we're happy to provide digital copies. So yes.
Let me know if this is more for in the groups. So the definition of what a goal is, I guess I'm trying to understand if the interpretation of the revised ed code is that every LCAP will have one goal for each state priority, or will we still have the leniency within our district to pick our own goals?
Correct. The flexibility in terms of how to create and structure goals is not going away. That will be maintained. So the ed code states that you have to have goals that address each state priority. That does not mean that you have to have 8 to 10 goals. That means that you have to have goals that address the totality of those state priorities. So the structure is 3 rounds, 20 minutes per round. The rotation after each round, and in the end, the ability to report out. At the tables, the structure is to provide a quick introduction, to review the feedback from any previous groups. That doesn't apply in the first group. That would be hearing what the groups that follow the first group have already said relative to that particular topic. And then sharing your thoughts and ideas relative to the topic, and then listening for patterns, insights, and connections within that, and identifying common themes. We'll ask one person from each of the table groups during the first session to serve as spokesperson for the group at the end, to summarize thoughts, feedback, comments of the group and their thoughts on that. And so in a moment here, we'll just go, since there's 3 groups, we'll just go around and number off 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and then break everybody up based on your numbers. So before we start, are there any additional questions? Okay. And if you need to take a break, please feel free, slip out, take a break, come back in, and re-engage. So with that, if we could begin with Member Aguilar. 1. All right, so if we could have 1s here at the table with my colleague Lydia Renteria, and 2s at the table with my colleague Jonathan Fiegel, and 3s will be with me at the back table where my colleague Nicole is. So with that, we will go ahead and move. trying to resolve. It's a complex task, and there's a lot of moving pieces. So we appreciate the different thoughts and experiences that you all bring to this process. So at this point, what we'd like to do is have those individuals that were asked to report out for their group about their thoughts, any themes that they saw, and any feedback related to the process as well. So, volunteer to go first?
Go first, and I'll be concise. So I think we can all say we appreciated the process, right? And being able to give input in all three areas. So thank you. It's very well structured. And appreciated the handouts, because that really, the visual examples, I think Janelle was asking that for that earlier, really do make a difference and generate thinking. So just two big ideas other than the specific feedback that was given at every table. One was at our first table, we went to the group on unduplicated students. And just a general comment back to your original charge, Joshua, which was the language and clarifying the language and how confusing that is when you have high needs in the document, but you're talking about unduplicated students, and just to help be consistent in the language and clear in what that means. And then the second was just a general comment about building a document with multiple functionalities. So we talked about being efficient. We, in our group, preferred the Excel spreadsheet format that gave a summary, but we know that's insufficient. But we wanted to be efficient for LEAs. So we talked about building documents that have hyperlinks. So summary documents have hyperlinks where you can click on the goal and go to a specific goal and get deeper information. Or the Excel spreadsheet that we looked at in the last group that tags personnel and non-personnel items with a formula at the bottom that will automatically compute these things. So we're just looking for ways to be efficient and not duplicate efforts for the LEA, and really focus efforts where it should go, and stakeholder engagement and deep thinking around continuous improvement.
Right. Thank you.
I would like to thank you guys for doing this too. I don't think I stole your mic. Yes, but we, our group really leaned toward the Excel sheet with the same thing, and thought like not to duplicate work for the person inputting these, because that's what we see is happening. But having the sheets feed into each other, so when you get to that section, you're really focusing on just the description, and the money is being calculated. That's automatically, things are done automatically. Which makes it a lot easier for the user, in the interface, how to get there. I think we've already wrote the program. As we went, we're already there. But to not reduplicate, the efforts by the LEAs or the schools. So basically the same thing. Would you guys concur with that? Yes.
Good. So I'll get the file from Jesse when we're done here.
Is it just overall feedback that we're giving?
You can give overall or specific. That's fine.
I think the overall was that it echoes, we want functionality, so certain portions of it, with Excel, so that you can manipulate it and play with the numbers or analyze them in different ways. As far as reporting out in descriptions, I think a theme that came out was to have more, to have each of the reports focused on by goal, so that you, as each, as districts or community-based organization groups are analyzing the LCAP, typically they do so, goal by goal within each district, so that if you have all the information reported in similar manner, then you're able to have a full analysis as to what worked, what didn't, and what you learned from it, so that you can apply all of that to the next year. That was one theme. Another theme, if anything is missing, feel free, for my teammates, to step up if you would like to mention other things. I think on the last of a specific discussion that we had in the last group was that we wanted to see, when it comes to metrics and outcomes, to have actual information so that we're able to compare how we're doing on all the goals that we've set year by year. Thank you.
So we appreciate all of your thoughts. We'll take these, we'll add these to the additional comments and feedback from stakeholders that we received this past week and that we'll receive on this coming Thursday. Again, at that point, we'll be taking those thoughts, synthesizing them, providing them to the internal feedback, the internal group that we've got, as well as to the advisory group for the redesign. And then based on the outcome of those discussions, we really hope to put together something that's more substantive, that provides all of these different segments in more of a cohesive layout so that it's easier to understand the way that the information is displayed. We're hoping that that will also lend itself to an additional discussion around sections such as stakeholder engagement, which tend to really, it helps if they're framed in the format of the document, because when you're talking about, as Araceli mentioned, when you're talking about the LCAP, the structure of the information and the way that that engages parents and stakeholders is really important. So that will also add and lend itself to that discussion as well. In terms of our next steps on this process, on June 13th, down in Ventura County Office of Education, we're holding a stakeholder input session. And then again on June 25th, we have a Tuesday at 2 webinar. That's June 25th is a Tuesday, and that will be at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The anticipated timeline at this point in time is to complete a draft prior to the September 2019 State Board of Education meeting. And then based on feedback that we received from the board at that meeting and any additional stakeholder feedback, to bring a final draft before the State Board for adoption at its November 2019 meeting. This is a number of months in advance of the July 2020 requirement, but we're hoping to be able to get this template finished and approved simply to provide us with that extra time that will really help to be able to do a cohesive rollout that's well informed, that's well structured, and that communicates to everybody where the changes are and what shifts need to be made, especially in terms of the framing of our planning and how to do a better job of articulating that incremental progress that's necessary towards meeting the long-term goals. So at this point, if there are any final questions. Yeah.
I don't have a final question, but I need to speak for my group mate. Speaking of that, communicating clearly and planning, that the LCAP should be submitted in September and not in May because of funds.
The annual update. Just because then we would have actual expenditures and student data from the prior year. And when we complete the annual update, it's not linked to our budget. So the idea that the LCAP and the budget really stay linked, and it would be two different submissions to your county office, your planning LCAP and then your annual update, but we submit the budget in two sections as well. So I'll just put that out there.
Okay.
You know, I'm sure that would be popular. I had a quick question. The stakeholder feedback you mentioned before we broke up, you said one of the things that they wanted was fewer prompts in the plan summary, but I don't know if you said why the stakeholders wanted that.
I think that in general, the feeling was that some of the prompts within the plan summary were somewhat duplicative in nature, and having to explain essentially the same thing in multiple fashions, it didn't necessarily lend itself to communication all that well, and it increased the length of the LCAP. Any additional questions? All right. Well, with that, thank you very much. We appreciate your thoughts, your input, and we hope to be able to show you what your input and the input of other stakeholders has brought forth in the coming months. So thank you.
Thanks, Joshua. And we'll look forward to the August meeting and input on those other 3 areas. So do we have any public comment on this item?
Yes, we have one person signed up for public comment, Liz Guillen from Public Advocates.
Good morning. Am I on? Liz Guillen with Public Advocates. I really appreciated the robust conversations that I was hearing at the tables. Public Advocates is one of the advocates in the advisory work group that Joshua mentioned. We have a lot of experience working with community stakeholders and parents and district staff to bring to bear to this conversation. One of the things I wanted to highlight is a disagreement with how Joshua interprets the statute with regard to what's required in the LCAP. The statute does say the board shall not require districts to provide any information in addition to what's in statute. But we think that means that the board should allow districts to remain as transparent as they have been in some cases. So for example, many districts have been doing a transparent job of showing LCFF funds versus LCFF supplemental and concentration dollars. And we think that's very important, especially because stakeholders have asked for that. The same in terms of personnel and non-personnel. If you've tried to monitor whether or not your supplemental and concentration funds are doing the job that you want them to do, but you've spent them among, a number of different personnel and different amounts, that's really hard to figure out. So you might want to provide additional information such as FTEs or locations, which is helpful for stakeholders because then they can know, yes, that person is providing a service to increase or improve for low-income students. One more point is the accessibility of language. I think especially around the demonstration, that has a legal requirement, and a lot of people don't know that, including some staff. So we think that increase or improve, principally directed, and effectiveness needs to be in there. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, we are ready to move on to our next agenda item. Can I do a check-in with people? Do people need a break before we shift gears into what will be a fairly lengthy item? Yes. Okay. So why don't we take, I'll say 5. I know it'll be longer, but let's say 5 and then we'll reconvene. All right. So let's move on to item 2. And I know as promised, we are revisiting a couple of the indicators on the dashboard for further discussion. This is a rather long item. There's a lot of input on this item. So we'll break it apart in pieces to allow for a little conversation in between, processing time, opportunity to ask questions, and we'll even give you a chance to get your lunch when it arrives. And then we will follow up with an opportunity for input and discussion. So you know, it will be rather lengthy in input, but there will be lots of time for discussion. So with that, we'll turn things over to item 2.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jenny Singh, and I am an administrator in the Analysis, Measurement, and Accountability Reporting Division, and I'm going to start off item 2. We will have another presenter a little bit later on. So today's topics, we're going to talk about incorporating a 5-year graduation rate into the graduation rate indicator. This is the section that's going to take the most time. And then we're going to talk about the application of the 3x5 colored tables for the College Career Indicator, or the CCI. And then we'll have Jonathan, who is going to be giving you an update on the English Learner Progress Indicator waiver, or the LP indicator. So let's start off with the 5-year graduation rate. So just a little bit of background. I'm sure all of you know that currently the 4-year cohort rate is used for the dashboard for non-alternative schools. We have a 1-year rate that we do for our alternative schools. And every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, provides the states the options to incorporate a 5-year graduation rate. They actually provided the option to do even more, an extended rate of 6 or even 7 years. It does have some criteria that goes along with that. For instance, if you include it as a separate indicator, so if we were to include it as its own indicator with the color, we would have to set a more rigorous long-term goal than what we have already set in our ESSA state plan. Currently, the goal is at 90%. So if we developed an indicator that had a 5-year grad rate that had its own indicator, we'd have to set a higher goal. We have done some extensive research on what other states have done in this category of combining the 4- and 5-year graduation rates. For example, a simple or weighted average. And based on districts that have done this simple or weighted average, the U.S. Department of Education did approve their plans. So as of now, those plans are approved. We do know that ED is coming back and asking states to make some revisions. We don't know if this is an area where they're going to be looking in. But at this point, if you combine the rates to one indicator, you can keep your long-term goals in place. So we did some extensive research. We actually looked at all the plans of all the states to come up with some options for us to explore. So as indicated before, we did bring this topic back to this group in August of 2018. Recall that in August of 2018, we did not have our grad data yet, so we did not have any data simulations that we could share for a 5-year grad rate. So we provided an overview on the calculations that we were going to do for the 5-year grad rate, and we put out some options that we were going to explore for incorporating a 5-year grad rate. Again, we did not have any data to do any simulations at that time. CPAG members formed 3 groups to discuss the pros and the cons of each of the options presented. And there was an overall consensus that was reached that a 5-year grad rate probably would be beneficial to schools. And of course, there were some concerns that were raised about a 5-year grad rate being added in. For example, there were some concerns expressed that if we have a 5-year rate, then schools may decide to hold students back a little bit longer. Instead of graduating them in 4 years, graduate them in 5 years. So you might recall that under AYP, Adequate Yearly Progress, we did have a 5- and a 6-year grad rate that was incorporated into our accountability system. So we went back and we looked at the data from when we were producing AYP, and we found that there was no patterns in delaying students to graduate in 4 years. So basically what happened is that over time, the 4-year grad rate went up and the 5-year grad rate went down. So I don't think that we need to be concerned about that, especially if we pick an option that doesn't provide a huge benefit for the 5-year grad rate. So just a reminder, the 5-year grad rate is not applied to the non-DAS schools. I said this a little bit earlier, but I want to repeat this because people keep thinking we're going to do a 5-year grad rate for DAS schools, and that is not correct. Recall that DAS schools, they have their own rate. We base it on grade 12. So there's students in grade 12, they could be 4-year graduates, 5-year graduates, 6-year graduates, or even beyond that. We have some credit recovery schools where students are taking 7 years to graduate. So we've got that covered under our 1-year rates. So just as a reminder, it's always important to remember this, is that we did have some audit findings from the U.S. Department of Education of the Inspector General about our grad rate, and we had to implement some new business rules in order to get to come into compliance. And those new business rules were only done with the graduating class of 2017 and 2018. So that means anything prior for the class of 2016 and prior, they have a different set of business rules that were applied for the 4-year cohort. And that's important because we only have those 2 years of data where the calculations were done exactly the same. So we actually did not we weren't able to do any simulations for the class of 2017 because they hadn't graduated yet. And we couldn't go back and look at simulations for other grad rates because they were done under different business rules. So we've been talking with our technical design group. I think we spent 3 or 4 meetings on this with our technical design group. And we know that they believe that there is a benefit to a 5-year grad rate, that it will incentivize schools and districts by giving them credit for graduating students in year 5. And we know that this is especially important for some student groups that take longer to graduate. Sometimes English learners, students with disabilities take a little bit longer to graduate, need a little more time. And sometimes they need a little more time. It gives them the time that they need to satisfy the A through G requirements. So we do have options that we're going to be talking about coming up, but before I move on, are there any questions, clarifying questions at this point? Okay. So we have 4 options that we're going to be discussing. One is just to report the 5-year rates for informational purposes only. And the SBE did approve this option for the 2018 dashboard. The other one is to calculate a simple or weighted average for the 4- and 5-year rates. And this is currently used by a significant number of other states. The third option is to develop a rate that combines 4- and 5-year graduates. And then option 4 is to report both 4- and 5-year grad rates separately and assign the higher of the 2 to get the performance color. And if we do this, we would have to set higher goals in our SS state plan. Okay, option for reporting the 5-year grad rate. This is pretty simple. We combine the 4- and 5-year graduates from a single cohort. So if you're looking at the students in the class of 2017, we've got all the students who graduated in the spring of 2017, and then we have to wait another year to see how many of those students who were in that cohort graduated in 2018. And they would make up the numerator, they would go into the numerator, and the denominator for the original cohort would stay the same. So that's really important to remember, that we're maintaining the same denominator. So, and we do that, you might recall from our conversation last year, is that we don't want the grad rate to go up simply because students have exited or moved to another school. So we keep the denominator stable. And again, since we only have only 1 year of data was available, 2 years of data, of course, is required. 2 years of 5-year data is required to produce a color. So the state board said that they wanted us to report the 5-year grad rate on the dashboard. And it's there. If you go onto the dashboard and you click on the graduation rate and you click on more detailed information, this is what you will see. So it is there for everyone to look at. So this is the calculation for just the 5-year grad rate. I don't know if you have any questions on this or if you want to take a few moments to discuss this before we go on to the second option. Good. This is the simple one. That's the descriptive text, B508 compliant. So option 2, calculate a simple or weighted average. So both averages are combined using 2 different groups of students. So we would be looking at students who are graduating in 2018, but we're looking at the class of 2018. Those are the students who graduated in 4 years. Then we're going to be looking at the class of 2017, and that's going to include those that graduated in 4 and 5 years. So this is important because there are other states who may be just using the same cohort. But then that means if we do that, we would have to use an older cohort, we would be having a lag year. So if we just want to do, averages for the 5 years, we would have to actually have a lag. And we all know that a decision was made not to have any lag data. So we're combining 2 different cohorts together. Yes.
So what you're saying is if we did the option 1, we wouldn't report the graduates from like the 17-18 school year until like 2020? I may have skipped a year in between, but you see what I mean? Because we would have to wait until we had both the 4 and the 5 year?
Right, we would be 1 year behind.
We couldn't report the 4 and then report the 5 the following year?
We could report them separately. That's one of the options. But if you're going to do an average, if you're going to combine doing a simple average or a weighted average, you have to use 2 different cohorts.
No, I'm just going back to option 1 though. But in option 1, you weren't meaning that we would hold the 4 year for a whole extra year until we could report the 4 and 5 at the same time, or were you?
No.
Okay.
No. This is just a reporting option. Okay. So what we did is we compared the 5-year rates for the class of 2017 to the 4-year cohort rate for the class of 2018. And you can see this in handout 1 that we sent you. You've got handout 1. You did indicate it that at the last time we spoke about this, that you wanted data when we did the simulations. So we heard that, and we're providing you with the data that you requested. So that's there. And you will notice that about 40% of the LEAs had negative differences in their graduation rates when we did a combined average, and about 60% had positive differences. So I think what most people believe is that if we use a 5-year, if we combine a 4 and 5-year rate, it will always have a positive difference, but that's not the case. And that's not surprising because remember, we had come back, we had asked this group before about the calculation of our current graduation rate indicator. We went from using a 3-year average to just doing the 1 year because we kept seeing the instability of the grad rates. So here's an example of a negative impact. So you can see here we have school A. They have almost 1,800 students in their cohort, and their 5-year cohort graduation rate is 84.8%. Then when you compare it to the following year, they have fewer students, less than 1,700 students, but their 4-year cohort graduation rate is 91.5, which means they're going to get an average rate of 87.9. So if we do the average for this particular school, their combined average for 4 and 5 is going to be lower than their 4-year cohort rate. Then we have school B. Now, even though school A had a significant number of students in the graduating cohort, we have school B that has a smaller number of students in the cohort, less than 500. Their 5-year cohort rate is 44.8%. And their 4-year cohort rate is 86%. And you can see that the number of students in their 4-year cohort is much smaller than in their 5-year cohort. Remember, we're looking at 2 groups of students. So if you average the 2 rates together, you will get a rate of 52.5%, which of course is lower than their 4-year cohort rate. And then here's an example that you can pull out. All of this information is in attachment 1 of something, example of a positive impact. So you can see here again with School A, a rather large school, over 2,000 students, and their 5-year cohort rate is 94.8%. Then when you look at their 4-year cohort, they still have a large number of students, a little bit more, almost 2,200, and their rate is 89.3%. You put these together, and the combined average is 91.9%. So their combined rate is larger than the 4-year cohort rate. And we have the same example with School B. Again, this is a small number of students, 77 students. For the 5-year rate, their rate is 97.4%. And for the 4-year rate, the number of students went up to 129, but their rate is at 52.7. When you combine those, they're at 69.4. I was a little surprised that we had this happening with schools that had large number of students and with schools that had small numbers. I had anticipated that this would only happen with small numbers, but it actually happened with schools that had large cohorts as well. So when we were looking at the results, we noticed that there really wasn't a clear pattern. So we noticed that you could have a negative or positive impact at high-performing schools and low-performing. High-performing, it was defined by those schools that had a blue or a green for the current graduation rate. Low-performing was red or orange. So you saw both positive and negative impacts at both high-performing and low-performing. And then the simple or weighted average resulted in a lower graduation rate for a significant number of schools, 40%. So with that, I think it might be a good idea for you to have maybe a small conversation amongst each other to talk about this option and see if you have any clarifying questions that you would like to ask. So do we want to take 2 minutes to partner up? Okay, it looks like most of you are have finished up your conversations. So if we can come back together, and I would be happy to answer any clarifying questions you may have thought of while you were discussing this with your partner. Any questions?
In my district, only about 25% of the kids who go on to a 5th year are in a non-DAS school. And I was wondering, is that typical? In other words, because we're already capturing a lot of those kids in the DAS 1-year rate, is this statewide going to actually capture a big percentage of kids? Do you see what I mean?
It doesn't capture a large percentage of students, because you're right, many of them are are transferring to alternative schools or DAS schools, but there are some schools that are actually keeping many of their students in a 5th year. So we wanted to make sure that we looked at this to give those schools credit for holding those students another year and graduating them with a regular high school diploma.
Can I add? Hi. Cindy Kazanis, Director of Analysis, Measurement, and Accountability Reporting Division. We also attended a meeting, I think it's been a year now, at Department of Rehabilitation, and there was very strong feelings from that group that this would incentivize schools and districts that do not offer a 5th year. You actually may be in a different group altogether in which you're proactive in that, but there are areas in this state where they don't offer it. And so it may incentivize districts to look at this student group differently and actually provide opportunities for students to continue their education to receive a diploma as opposed to getting a GED. Mm-hmm.
Okay. No other clarifying questions. We're going to move on to option 3. And we're calling this option the combined rate. You know, so if you guys have any other names you would like to assign these, we would take that as input. But We came up with a combined rate because it got really confusing for us. So we wanted to at least come up with something that was short and succinct. So this reflects the students who are graduating in a given year. So for example, if we look at the spring of 2018, we look at those graduates, it's going to be based on those students who are in the class of 2018 who graduate. And then we're going to add the fifth year students from the class of 2017. So it's still two separate cohorts, but we're taking all those students who graduated either in 4 years or 5 years and putting them into this combined graduation rate. This methodology does provide LEAs and schools credit for graduating their fifth year seniors. However, more weight is given to the 4-year cohort since fifth year graduates are added to both the numerator and the denominator. And this is the option that our technical design group, or TDG, recommended. And so here's the formula for that. So for a school, you're going to take your 4-year graduates for the class of 2015, and then you're going to add in your fifth year graduates for the class of 2017. And you do that with the numerator. And then for the denominator, we're looking at the cohort, the 4-year cohort, just like we do with our current rate. All the students who are in the cohort for the 4-year for the class of 2018, and then we're just adding in those fifth year graduates into the denominator. The LEA and state level, that's a little trickier because we are putting, of course, we have a 1-year rate that we're rolling up to the LEA level. So it's the 4-year plus the 1-year graduates plus the 5-year graduates. So that's a little more complicated. So here's an example of how we combine them. So if we're looking at the class of 2018, we see that there are 95 graduates out of 100 students, right? That's how many are in our 4-year cohort. So then we go and we look at the class of 2017, and we see that 5 additional students graduated in their fifth year. So they graduated in 2018. So we're going to combine these two numbers. We're going to take the 95 graduates from the class of 2018. We're going to take those additional 5 graduates and add them together, 95 plus 5. And then we're going to divide it by the 100 students who were in the cohort for the class of 2018, with the addition of the 5 extra students who graduated in the spring, who graduated in their fifth year for 2018, for a rate of 25.24. So because this was a methodology that our technical design group was interested in pursuing, we did quite a bit of analysis on that. Staff compared the combined rate with the class of the 2018 4-year cohort graduation rate. And we looked, this analysis was done at the school and the district level. We looked at the overall graduation rates. We looked at small versus large schools. Keep in mind that the small schools defined as having 149 or less students. We looked at high and low performing. Again, high performing means we were looking at the graduate for schools and districts that had a color of blue or green. Low performing was school or districts that had a color of red or orange. And then we looked at charter versus non-charter. Of course, this was only done at the school level here. And we also wanted to look at the state level impact for certain specific groups: African Americans, English learners, students with disabilities, and foster youth. These groups were chosen because they traditionally have a lower 4-year graduation rate. So here is the summary data for option 3. So you'll notice that the bigger impact here is at the lower percentiles. And you can notice that it can be a significant impact. When you look at the 5th percentile, it goes from a 4-year grad rate for the school of 61.9 to 64.6. And then all the way up to about the 25th percentile, it's about 1 to 2% increase. And we see the same pattern over with the districts as well. So the biggest impact is happening at the lower percentiles here. So we looked at the large schools versus small schools. So you can see here that for large schools, their four-year graduation rate was 92.4, and that went up to 92.5. That's not unusual at a statewide level, because when you're talking about large numbers of students and you graduate a smaller number in the fifth year, it's not going to have a big impact. It's not going to have a big impact on the numerator. For small schools, it went from 85.3% to 85.6% statewide. That is a bigger impact, of course. Remember, this is statewide data that you're seeing here. So I would say that that was a significant impact for small schools. That's not unusual, because if you have a small denominator and you're adding in more students to the numerator, that is going to have a bigger impact on the small numbers. There was a bigger impact for charter schools than non-charter schools. So the charter schools, they went from an 84.8% to an 85.2%. And then our biggest impact came with the lower performing schools, which you saw from the chart in the previous page. You can see it went from 78.9% to 79.5%. Again, this is statewide data, so an increase of 1% or 0.5% at the statewide level is pretty significant. And then we have our summary data by student groups. So you can see overall that for all students, it went from 83.7% to 83.5%. Oh, I'm sorry, the other way around, 83.5 to 83.7. And then you can see that for the student groups, we had the biggest impact for foster youth. It went from 59 to 60%. And then we have students with disabilities and English learners, where that's a pretty big impact as well. So this is the descriptive test. So the impact of the combined rate. The combined rate has a greater impact on charter schools versus non-charter schools, small schools and districts versus large schools and districts, lower performing schools and districts versus high performing schools and districts. And it did have an impact on the student groups that currently have the lower four-year cohort rates: African American, English learners, students with disabilities, and foster youth. So with that, I don't know if you want to have your group conversation, spend 2 minutes with each other talking about this option, and then let me know if you have clarifying questions that I can answer before we move on to the next option. So about 2 minutes. Okay, it sounds like most of the conversation is winding down. So based on the conversation you had pairing up, are there any clarifying questions you would like to ask before we move on to the next option? Yes.
Just a real quick clarifier. The LEA inclusion of the 1 year rate, that's picking up the DAS kids, right? The DAS
Yes.
schools. Okay.
When you were referencing earlier that this combined approach incentivizes the 4-year graduation, or graduating in 4 years.
So it puts more weight on the 4-year.
Can you expand on that? I mean,
right. So when you just when you have your 4-year rate, you're just adding students who are 5th-year graduates into both the numerator and the denominator. When you do that, they don't contribute as much weight as the 4-year, because they're being added to both the numerator and the denominator. Much like we did with the English Learner Progress Indicator for RFEP students, we added all RFEP students into the numerator and denominator, and when you do that, the weight is less.
Very quick question. Thank you. I'm intrigued by the option 3 recommendation, in particular because I think earlier you used the example of English learners who might need more time to, say, complete the AG course pattern. I know that for many of our English learners the way that the English college prep sequence usually works. Yes, you can run out of time because you're going to graduate. But I'm interested in better understanding within that combined formula whether we have access to information that gives us the ability to draw some conclusions about who the students are that are graduating in the 5th year as well. And that is, to what extent are they English learners who were only missing an additional year of college prep A to G approved English versus, say, students who were credit deficient because they were suspended disproportionately, let's say. The reason why I ask is I want to make sure that we don't end up with most of our 5th year students being underrepresented, underserved students. And so while we recognize that the initial analyses appear to suggest that students such as African American English learners, students with disabilities, and foster youth are the beneficiaries, I just want to be able to see how so and to what extent.
So it would be, I don't think it's possible for us to pull out to determine the A through G requirement versus whether it was credit deficiency for 2 reasons. One, every district has their own standards for graduation, and I do not know how many credits a student needs at a particular district and, to graduate, because it varies by district. And then 2, the A through G requirements are very complex, and some classes meet more than one requirement, but you can only use them for one or the other. So it's really hard to say. We did some analysis on A through G a couple of years ago, and it was very difficult to determine which courses met specific categories. So it was hard for us to say whether they met A through G requirements in all the categories because of that. So it was not something that it's not something we can do at this time. Now, we are revising course data in CalPADS for the collection of starting next year, and that might be a possibility as we move forward, but that's not something we can do at this point in time. And the reason we mention the A through G requirements is because we do know there are some schools out there who, some specific charter schools, who want to make sure that all their students graduate with A through G. So they keep them an extra year for that purpose.
I still have a question on, so I get the English learner and the A to G piece, and I mean, in my experience, I would say that it would be beneficial for English learners to be counted as 5th year graduates, because normally it's going to be in the English subject area where they would run out of time just based on the way that the sequence works for mastering English, if you will. It typically is not in the other subject areas. So I'm fine with that. But in terms of the idea that the other beneficiaries are African American students with disabilities and foster youth, can we still figure out whether it's because of issues such as credit deficiencies? And further, to what extent is the credit deficiency a result of behaviors? Because then I'm afraid that we will see many of those students appearing as 5th year graduates as opposed to 4-year graduates. In the case of ELs, I understand that even if you try to get them to graduate in 4 years with 4 years of college prep English, sometimes that's difficult. But I also would want to make sure that we have more evidence that our 5th year graduates are not 5th year graduates because of credit deficiencies and because of, or that the credit deficiencies are the result of things like disproportionate suspension rates, for example?
So again, I cannot determine credit deficiencies with the data that we currently have in CalPADS. We could possibly do an analysis around the fifth-year graduates to see what their suspension rates look like. That I could do, but I cannot tell you if they were credit deficient.
And just to add, with our dashboard alternative school status, there was similar concerns about the one-year graduation rate, or the grade 12, and the board has asked us to do additional analysis now that we have a richer set of data. I can only imagine that we'll probably be asked to do something similar with this group, because of course accountability encourages behaviors, some good, hopefully for the good, but there are some for the bad, is which I think you are somewhat describing, is we don't want to track a certain set of students and not have them benefit from graduating on time. So that is something that you're not going to know until you implement something. But the other piece I wanted to mention, and Jenny's alluded to this, is there is certain things that we do collect in our student level data system at the state level, and there's other things that we don't. We leave it to the local level. So one thing that we don't know is how many courses you need to get through to get over that mark for A through G requirements. We only ask if you completed them. It's a yes/no question. So some of the things that you may think that we have, we don't. We've left that to the local level to make that determination. So some of these things may be very difficult for us to actually engage in due to lack of data, as Jenny's mentioned.
So that's when you hope that if the LCAP process is really working, that LEAs are asking exactly those kinds of questions, right? And looking at their own data more deeply, especially on the fifth-year graduates.
Because you brought up what data the state does and doesn't have, and because we're talking a little bit about foster youth, so the ability of foster youth and now newcomers to get a state diploma and not do their district's diploma requirements, is that something that districts are reporting to the state so that you could so in other words, they don't necessarily have to stay for the fifth year because they have an option to just do the state diploma?
They have lower credits is what you're talking about.
Right. Are you guys capturing, are you asking districts to send you that information when students are taking that option?
I don't believe so, but I would have to check with our CalPADS personnel to answer that question.
You have to put it in CalPADS.
You do have to put it in CalPADS? Okay, because I think that'll be good information. It would potentially offset this, because then kids wouldn't need to stay.
We're not collecting graduation requirements. So we don't know how many credits are needed, even if they are, considered a foster youth. There's not a connection there on if they graduated under the foster youth status or they graduated with their traditional.
All right, so you're not saying state diploma versus district's graduation requirements?
I'm pretty sure that that's not been collected in CalPADS. It may be something that they may be adding.
It is documented that they're under the foster youth program. Is that varied by district?
But is it how they graduate, or you're saying they're just marked as a foster youth?
We should look at the code sets, and we can get back to you.
Yeah. Okay. We need our CalPADS people here to answer that question. They're the experts. Okay. Any other clarifying questions before we move forward? Okay. So option 4 is to report both rates and assign the higher of the two, the performance level based on the higher of the two. So that compares graduation rates for 2 separate cohorts again. So we would look at the class of 2018, the 4-year cohort rate, and then the class of 2017, their 5-year graduation rate. So again, it's really important to understand we're looking at 2 separate cohorts here. So it's similar to option 1. The 5-year graduation formula combines the 4 and 5-year graduates from a single cohort. Same formula that we're using, just repeated here. So we provided you with a lot of handouts, a lot of information. Handouts 2 and handout 3 has a lot of data in there. But the summary data for option 4 is this: assigning colors to the higher graduation rate, the 4-year versus the 5-year, would result in some LEAs and schools that have very low graduation rates to receive a substantially higher performance level. You can see that on page 5 of handout 1. So for instance, we have a district here who has a 4-year rate of 57.7%. That 4-year rate is below the 67% threshold that we set for the red performance color. And then they have the 5-year graduation rate at 97.4%. So that's a huge difference, almost 40%. So they go from a very low status to a very high status. Because we don't have another year of 5th-year grad data, I cannot tell you whether the class of 2018 would have a lot of 5th-year graduates. Don't know that. Don't know. I don't have the data to show that. But I'm predicting, based on my knowledge of the data, that there is some fluctuation going on there. And we have another one that has a 4-year grad rate of almost 47%, and a 5-year grad rate of 85%. Again, a very big difference here. They go from very low to medium. And then we have one that just goes from very low to low. They have a 49% rate to a 74% rate. Yes.
So you do have the 4-year rates of the class of 2017. And my question would be, did they really have a big decline in their 4-year rates between 17 and 18? Or was their 17 4-year rate similar to their 4-year rate for 18, and they really just always graduate a lot of 5th-year students? Do you see what I mean? I don't know what's happening there.
So you might refer to the table in handout 1. We saw a lot of flexibility between the 4 and the 5 and the 5-year rate. So up and down. So here's some summary table for option 4. This is at the LEA level. And what I want to point out here, so what I want to point out here is that if we implemented this option, that there would be no districts that would receive a red performance level. So we currently have 27 districts, and it would go to 0. And you can see here that at the low performance level, that is also reduced. It goes from 3.8% to down to 2.6%. We also have a reduction at the medium level, again from 26% to 25%. And we start having increases at the high and the very high level. Oops. And here is the data at the school level. It's not as pronounced. We still have some schools who have a very low performance level, but it's reduced. Again, we see there's a reduction at the low level and at the medium level. And here, there's actually a reduction at the high level because most of our increase is seen at the very high level. So, assigning the highest of the 2 graduation rate increases the performance colors for select LEAs and schools. However, it also results in no LEAs receiving a red performance level for the graduation rate indicator, even though their 4-year rates are below 67%. And then it would also impact some schools would not be receiving comprehensive support under ESSA based on the low graduation rate. So I think, yeah. So I don't know if you want to take a few minutes to talk with your partners again and see if you have any clarifying questions for me. Just 2 minutes. Okay. Okay, it sounds like we're winding down a little bit. So if we can come back together. Okay, so if we can come back together, that would be great. So after having a conversation with your thought partners, are there any clarifying questions that you have for me right now? Okay. So with that, then, we're going to break out into three groups and do a group activity. I want each group is going to identify the advantages and disadvantages of each of the options that we have just gone through. We are going to have one person at your table to help answer any clarifying questions as you move forward, but we are asking that you assign someone to be your note taker and assign someone to be the person who's going to report out afterwards. So if we can count off by threes, starting over here with Jorge. Same groups. All right, go back in your same groups. So let's put group 1 at this first table, group 2 at the second table, and group 3 at the back table. We could do that. Yeah. So what we could do is we could start with Nancy as the person who starts off. If you want different groups. Same group? It can't be the same group. Because I started with you. Why don't you form your own groups of 3? And I won't argue about how you do that. Well, it sounds like you guys were having a lot of fun. Or at least that's how I'm going to interpret it. Yes, I've taken note of that. Okay, great. So what I would like to do is to ask someone to volunteer to go first and report out what your group came up with.
So I represent group 1, or actually I think with our renumbering, the original group. I'm with the original group. That's what I'll. So we there were 2 main ideas that occurred in our discussion. It was both looking at things from looking at the options from an incentive standpoint, and I would even go as far as to say accountability. So we spent a significant amount of time talking about option 1 and option 3 and trying to determine where the incentives are and looking at it both in terms of like the mathematical formula. So I'll just set the stage there. Jorge, do you want to add to that?
Where can there be more weight between the culture and behavioral incentives that we can create versus the mathematical incentives? Our best, I mean, I'm not a math person, but our best assessment was that neither option 1 nor 3 mathematically incentivize us to ensure that we graduate the highest number of students that should have graduated in 4 years in their 5th year. And so then the question became, without that mathematical incentive, which of the two options incentivize the kind of culture that we'd want to see? And that's where we kind of left off. Because we didn't want to create a system where people think, well, you know, we still have 2 years to graduate them technically, on the one hand, but we also wanted to make sure that we thought about how do we take into consideration how many students graduated in their 5th year out of what group that didn't graduate in 4 years. And I'm struggling even now to describe it, but.
So let me ask a clarifying question. So I think the option, from my perspective, option 3 provides a big incentive to graduate students in 4 years, if at all possible, because that's going to be the basis of the biggest portion of the basis for your graduation rate. It also provides some incentive to keep students and graduate them in 5 years. So are you saying that you don't think that adding the 5 years in provides a big enough incentive?
No, it does. And what I'm wondering, and this was just again for me, my confusion in that option, the group that we are considering in terms of the 5th year graduates is 4 year, is of the class that should have graduated a year before.
Correct.
Correct?
Correct.
But in the hypothetical that you gave, it shows that 5 students graduated in their 5th year. Out of how many? And it's
yes,
that, it's
this model
how
does not take into consideration out of how many,
That's
because they're
correct.
being added into the numerator and
Yes,
the denominator.
yes. So then mathematically, the incentive isn't driven by the mathematical equation of how many question. It just takes into consideration how many graduated.
That is correct. It only takes into consideration how many graduated, but they're added into the 4 year, with the 4 year students. So their weight is much less. That's why I thought you thought that there wasn't enough mathematical incentive to keep students at 5th year.
No. I knew that
Okay.
there was an incentive to
Okay.
keep them. I was just trying to think whether the question of how many could be used as an additional incentive, mathematically speaking.
Okay. I get it now. Thank you. Thank
So
you
I
for
think
that clarification.
you're getting a glimpse
Yeah.
of what our discussion was about. Where I think ultimately we wanted to look at how to create a high level of accountability and culture within the current year. And yet, and this is where Jorge is going to, looking at when you have X number of students who did not graduate in 4 years, let's say there's 20, then what are the incentives now around that 20? Does that make sense?
Yes.
And ultimately, you're going to benefit from how many ultimately graduated, but you're not taking into account the denominator.
Correct.
For that,
So, yes,
for that 5th year.
I understand that.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you. That was very helpful.
I can go ahead and report out for original group 2 or group 1 2.0. So what we discussed, actually, our conversation was also around mainly option 1 and option 3. In trying to kind of follow the table, we identified that potentially all of them give credit for students, and they all continue to keep students really engaged in some capacity. One potential disadvantage is that 5th year students can get lost in options 2 through 4 if they're not specifically identified, which goes kind of to Jorge's point. It was really interesting how our conversation led to us agreeing to kind of option 3, but potentially being able to identify the 5th-year students, going back and referencing to slide 12. I think that was just a really interesting and important conversation that we had. Bootsy or anyone else?
Yeah, we liked that in option 3, we could see a benefit across the board, but we were worried about the same concerns that Jorge had. So the slide 12 that Nancy's referring to broke down the student groups who are graduating in year 5, and we just felt like that was necessary to accompany option 3. That if you're going to do option 3, that these groups can't get sort of buried, that this data also needs to be transparent.
So what I'm hearing is that if we went with option 3, you would still like us to report both the 4 and the 5-year cohort graduation rates.
That's correct.
Okay. That leaves group 3.
The great group 3. That's the reason we hang longest. So, and I think we came very much the same conclusion. I'll start at the bottom. We basically said option 4 doesn't tell you anything helpful. And we liked option 1 from the perspective of the school's internal use and growth and planning, that breaking out the 4th-year rate from the 5th-year rate and having that data separate, very much like the others have said, is exceedingly helpful, but it does not add any, doesn't help with the accountability piece. It helps with other reports and information that you want for the school. So what we were kind of came down to is that option 3 is intuitively understandable by the public at large, and it gives some credit to those 5th-year graduates, so schools that are dealing with those students do in fact get credit for them, but we want the report out for the 4th and 5th years separate.
Okay, great.
I want to add something for group 3, sort of to piggyback off of what Jorge was saying earlier about the specific groups and why, because I feel as you go on to collect the data, whichever option we'll go with, I believe most students that'll be in 5th year will be students that are deficient in math credits or EL, which I don't know, but probably more deficient in math credits by way I look at how I see credits and how students come in from traditional schools.
Any other comments? Thank you very much. That was very, very helpful. We really appreciate your thoughtful input into this particular indicator. And I know it took a lot of thought to go through all of those different formulas, so thank you. So I just wanted to provide you with an update on our CCI indicator, our college career indicator. So you all know by now that schools and students or in districts with small student populations are more susceptible to large swings in the results from year to year, just because their numbers are small. So this can lead to an over-identification of schools, districts, and student groups in both the red and the blue performance level. And I say that and because everyone noticed, the public or stakeholder groups noticed that there was an overrepresentation in the red, but not the blue. But it is in both. So so this was especially true for the graduation rate indicator, the suspension rate indicator, and chronic absenteeism indicator. So because of this, we worked with our TDG and with various stakeholder groups to come up with an alternative method that we use for small students populations. And what we decided to do was to change the 5x5 table to a 3x5 table. That removes the increase significantly and the decrease significantly column for change. And this is applied to an N size of 149 or less. And this was applied for the 2018 dashboard for the graduation rate indicator. Keep in mind that the N size is always based on the denominator, and the denominators vary by indicator. So for the grad rate, it's the number of students in the 4-year cohort, or the DAS graduation rate. For the suspension rate indicator, it's the number of students that are cumulatively enrolled. That means all the students who have been enrolled at your school throughout the year. So students who started there that exited and went to another school or transferred to another school, they're still counted in that denominator. And then for chronic absenteeism, it is the number of students who meet the enrollment eligibility requirements. You might recall that for chronic absenteeism, you have to be at the school at least 31 days to get in there. That's the biggest requirement. So this is what it looks like, our 5x5 grid and our 3x5 grid, right? So we're just removing the far columns, the increase significantly and the decline significantly. You will notice that with the 3x5, a school can earn this all 5 colors, just like the 5x5, okay? So they can still receive a red, orange, yellow, green, or blue. So, yeah, I'm missing a slide really. So basically, because the CCI is actually based on the 4-year cohort for non-alternative schools and on the 1-year grad rate for the DAS schools, we felt it was really important to apply the 3x5 to the CCI as well. And I've gotten questions from various groups saying, why didn't you do this last year? Why are you doing it this year? Well, we just ran out of time last year. There was a lot of things that we had to do, and we just couldn't get this addressed last year. So we want to make sure to get it addressed for this year. So the impact on the CCI for LEAs is overall, the impact is small percentages of LEAs, 2% of cases for LEAs, and about 3.5% of cases for schools, where they will have a difference in their color. And a bigger impact on student groups, about 6%. So what is that impact? Remember I said that we have some, that are overrepresented in blue and some overrepresented in red. So the impact really is more schools obtain a higher performance level. That's a 2.1%. And then more student groups obtain a higher performance level, 4.1%. So we have more that get a benefit from this than gets the decrease. So of course, for the decrease, when only 2.1% get a higher increase, then we're looking at 1.5% that's going to go down, a decrease. And this is all in handout 3, tables 1 through 4. The impact on the CCI on cohort groups is impacted differently by various student groups. Homeless students fare much better. They get an increase. And you can see that in handout 3, tables 5 through 7. Again, this is just information purposes. We're taking this to the board in July, just like we are with the graduation rate. And so with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have before we move on to our next topic. Great. So I would like to invite Jonathan Eisler up to talk about the English Learner Progress Indicator Waiver.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? All right, so I'm Jonathan Eisler. I'm with the Analysis, Measurement, Accountability Reporting Division. I work with Jenny and Cindy. Very lucky to have them as my colleagues. So I'm going to just walk quickly through an update on our English Learner Progress Indicator, or ELPI, waiver request. As many of you may remember, we brought this particular item to this group a couple years ago. We brought this item to State Board of Education, to various stakeholder groups, Bilingual Coordinators Network, and we created an LP work group, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I will say Jenny, with pretty much every one of her items and indicators, there's a lot of debate, there's a lot of discussion, there's not always easy or quick consensus. This particular item that we're talking about today in terms of including previous year reclassified students in the LP indicator, as well as including an extra weight for long-term ELs into the indicator, which we originally did, was literally one of probably maybe the only item that was like consensus like from the beginning. It was one of these items where technical design group, LP work group, national experts said, this is a great idea. And again, Jenny, have you had that luck with any of your stuff? So this is the one indicator that my office produces, and we had this, so we're like, this is great news, until we presented this to U.S. Department of Education. As you know, it was included originally as part of our ESSA state plan. So anyways, we'll get to that in just a minute here. So this is one of the items. We had the CELT, the old EL assessment, and now we've switched to the LPAC. But so all of this original work that we did in terms of including the reclassified students and including the extra weighting for the long-term ELs was based on that data from the CELT. So we knew that was an item moving forward. So this work group was created to kind of vet different parts of the methodology, and in particular the part of the methodology that we knew we were going to have to ask the federal government to waive was this inclusion of the RFEPs into the equation and an extra weighting for long-term ELs in the equation, because as ESSA is written, it's explicit that it states it should be current ELs in the equation. So obviously RFEPs are not current ELs by that definition. As I mentioned, Bilingual Coordinators Network weighed in on this, the LP work group. We talked to various experts from around the country. So we talked to Pete Goldschmidt, Fen Shu, Gary Cook, Robert Linquanti. All of these are folks that are nationally known experts on reclassification, on English learner assessments, universally. Again, consensus. This is a really good idea. There's no technical problems. There's no technical barriers. This is something that absolutely would be a good idea for California to do. So when I say stakeholders were supportive, that really is the case with this particular indicator. So we were required to write up a waiver to the U.S. Department of Education to include these two elements into the methodology for our indicator. So in April of 2018, the state board directed the CDE to make the actual waiver request, which we did in May. That was submitted. We waited a long time last summer, and then finally in October, we received what's called an initial determination of denial letter. But we knew that there were additional steps that we could take, which we did. So very briefly afterwards, we resubmitted the waiver request. We provided additional information, additional evidence and research in support of the request. And then we waited again. And then in January of this year, myself, Cindy, member of the State Board of Education, as well as English Learner Support Division, traveled to Washington, D.C. We actually had an in-person meeting with one of the deputies at the U.S. Department of Education and many of their staff. The meeting went very well. If people want to know about the meeting, I'd be happy to tell you more about it. It was a very good hearing, very positive. They engaged us in a lot of really pointed questions. We had responses to those questions. We had data. We had a lot of evidence, I think, to back up the case. And then we waited again. We waited 3 months, and then finally in April, we did receive what's called the final disapproval of waiver letter, which of course is different from the initial, like it's final. And that is available in a state board memo that you can see posted here if you want to check that out. So at this point, we did a lot of thinking and talking internally. We're at the end of the line, I think, is kind of the bottom line here. We've exhausted all of the different mechanisms and means by which we can kind of fight this. And I think, the stakeholders have weighed in on this. We brought this to the Bilingual Coordinators Network. We brought this to our LP work group last month. And I don't, from practically, logistically, legally, it doesn't seem like we have any other recourse. That being said, I think the initial reasoning behind putting these two groups into our LP indicator is, of course, to be more transparent about these two populations, to bring a focus to it within accountability, within the data that's presented. And so there's a lot that Jenny and Cindy have done with the dashboard already to provide disaggregated information about reclassified students in the academic indicators. We wanted to keep pushing the issue forward, even if we can't officially do this through through the LP methodology. So one of the good ideas that came up at our LP work group meeting last month is to actually consider putting an extra weighting or additional consideration for RFEP and LTEL students in how we determine the California Distinguished Schools program. So that's absolutely something that we think is a good idea to pursue. We're gonna look into the viability of that and report back out to the public about that. So that is one of the items that, even though we can't officially put it into the formula as we had originally hoped and experts agreed, concurred, that is something that we can do that goes beyond just data reporting, but can actually, there is actually a consequence, a positive consequence of focusing on these populations. So that's pretty much where we're at. I know we're including this information at next month's state board meeting as well, but be happy to open it up for comment. Yes?
Does that share their thinking?
I think that's a good question. One of the things that we, in our response letter, both in October and actually at the in-person meeting, is we made the very strong case that this is an example of a waivable item, because there are certain things under ESSA that are just, are not waivable. One of the things I think that they were really sticking to their guns, that the law was written as it is. So even though they had the discretion, they never really said this in the letter, but that was kind of the impression we had gotten, was that, yes, it is waivable, but we're choosing not to waive this particular item. Yes?
So I commend you for hanging in there for so long, you know, two big rounds of,
yes,
you know, applying for this waiver. One of the things that I'm interested in is in your fact finding, did you find anything that was even close to a precedent from another state's ESSA plan that came close to this?
No, and it's funny because we talked to some of the WIDA states, we talked to a different consortium that use different EL assessments, and part of the issue is, since there are other states that are switching assessments midstream, kind of like we are, the difference is, and why it really wasn't applicable to use other states as examples, although no one else that we know of was doing this, but even though there are other states that are moving from one EL assessment to another, they weren't switching ELA, ELD standards like we are. So in other words, the CELT was based on the 1999 ELA, ELD standards. The LPAC is based on the 2012. So we're jumping 13 years forward in terms of a new ELA, ELD. So that was one huge difference to us that was different. But in terms of other states, we're not aware of any other states that were trying to include RFEPs, let alone also include the extra weighting for LTES. Not that we're aware of, no. You know? We thought it was a good idea, but yeah. Any questions or comments or?
Verify
Yes.
about the implications. Does that mean all those three populations are going to be disaggregated in the dashboard now?
No, so for the academic indicator, that just you have the RFEP, and then you have, Cindy's gonna weigh in.
I think you may be asking a question about the academic indicator. These were never disaggregated in the English Learner Progress Indicator. What the waiver was asking was that we can include them as part of the population, and they've told us they are not current English learners. So they are being totally removed from the English Learner Progress Indicator. In every single other indicator, we have English learners. The one exception is for the academic indicator, we're allowed to include up to 4 years, and that's where the disaggregation takes place on the dashboard that you see that the state board took action on a couple of years ago. But that does not include, it's never included long-term English learners. That is a very specific population that we've actually, we feel like we're ahead of a lot of other states on being transparent around the LTEL issue.
Right. Okay, that was it from me, so thank you very much.
Thank you for fighting the good fight. That is the danger of being too far ahead, right, of your time. Others will catch up, and then maybe it'll be time to raise the issue again. Thank you. Any general questions from CPAG members on that item? Haven't been raised? Any of the three? Public comment? No public comment? All right, so we'll move on to item 3, which is just an approval of the draft minutes. You should have a current copy of the draft minutes from our February 6th, 2019 meeting. Be sure that's the one you're looking at. It's not the one in your folder. It's the one that you were just recently given. It's February 6, 2019 date. I'll give you a minute to look it over, and if somebody is ready to make a motion to approve the draft minutes. Was that a yes? Thank you. We have a motion to approve the draft minutes. Is there a second?
A second.
Thank you. All in favor? I'm sorry, any discussion? All in favor? Opposed? All right, so we've approved the draft minutes. So we're just about at the end. Any general comments from questions from CPAG members? I'm sorry. Kimberly, did you have a question, comment?
So on this item, if CPAG members are interested in adding things to our agenda, how does that process work?
Well, thank you for that question, Member Kenny. That's a good question. I think we're going to need to do a little bit of research and get back to you on that, okay? Thank you.
So the reason I ask is, one time I had some questions and then I said, well, that's not really part of this. And oftentimes I think there are related matters that would be great to ask questions. And so my other kind of request is that this item that usually just has the minutes not be always moved to the beginning of the meeting, because I think sometimes there are things that occur to people where they might want to, pose a question during this time. But if it happens at the beginning, then that opportunity is already gone, and it may not have percolated up until the end of the meeting. So I just think that would be great. I mean, I think that you always bring us interesting things to talk about, but I know that there are often other things, and it would be nice if we had the opportunity and the ability to kind of say, hey, here's this other topic that the CPAG might want to talk about. And I'm assuming we could always bring up something during this time and that potentially could hit the agenda next time. I just wasn't sure how that worked.
This is a time for general comments, so are there any general comments that you would like to bring up at this time for consideration? All right. We'll know that there's always this time at the end of the meeting for general comments or questions, so that space is open. Anyone else? General comments, questions? Do we have any general public comment? Did I see a finger on the microphone? Ed, did you want any general comment? All right. That was exactly what I was going to say. Thank you all for being here at this very, very busy time of year. I know. Thank you to the team again for not only very thorough and comprehensive presentations, but a great opportunity for discussion. So thank you for the format, and have a good summer, everybody. Travel safely. We'll see you in August. Meeting is officially adjourned.